Assalamu alaikum, you're watching Views and News and I'm Faisal Rehman live from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about a very important development that is about the statement of the US Secretary of State. He has congratulated Pakistan on the Independence Day and also vowed that United States of America is seeking long-term multi-dimensional relationship with Pakistan. Now the question would be, what exactly do they mean by that? Multifaceted or multi-dimensional? Is it about the military aid? Is it about the financial aid? Is it going to be about some sort of aid through the US, United States of America, or perhaps it is going to go way beyond that? Obviously, we do understand one thing, which is for sure, that the Americans have a strategic partnership with the Indians. And obviously, the main reason behind it is the China containment policy. No wonder they are in Afghanistan even now as we speak, though the amount of soldiers or the boots on ground, as we say, that's very limited. Perhaps only a few operators are there. But having said that, where will it go from here? Secondly, ever since 9/11, Pakistan was looked upon through the prism of Afghanistan, that AFPAC policy of Barack Obama, if you remember. So whatever was happening in Pakistan, the Americans were only concerned about the Afghan situation. They stayed there for about 21 years, and then exactly on the 15th of August, which is today, but I'm talking about the last year. So it's been exactly 1 year ever since the Americans left and the Taliban took charge of the government. Their regime wasn't recognized by any and still hasn't been. But at least if there is a party there, who to talk to? And perhaps the Americans are not very happy after killing Mr. Zawahiri in a drone strike, and they thought that the Taliban must have either eliminated Al-Qaeda, but again, the presence of such a top man of Al-Qaeda and then eliminating him proved one thing, that perhaps he was living in Afghanistan with the support of the Taliban, because he wasn't killed in some far-flung area. He was killed in the main city while he was enjoying perhaps his cup of tea in the early morning hours. And he was, first of all, it was determined that it was him. There was a lot of recce before that. And then once he was there, he was eliminated. Now, another very important development was after about a week or so, when Umar Khalid Khorasani, the head of the Moment chapter and now was a very important member of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, was also eliminated. So obviously the fallout factor is going to be on Pakistan, and then we have seen this recent wave of violence in Pakistan. Every other day we hear that X number of Jawans have been martyred. Yesterday 2 Jawans got martyred and a major was also injured in an intelligence-based combing operation, or otherwise so many casualties are also reported because of these IEDs along the roadside. Now where will it lead? What exactly is going to happen? What sort of difference Afghanistan is experiencing at the moment during the last 1 year? Has it changed for better or has it changed for worse? This is what we'll be talking about. And obviously, as I earlier mentioned, that whenever the Americans look upon Pakistan, there is a prism which is placed somewhere in, I would say, Kabul, and they look at it from that perspective. Now, are they going to change their policy? This AFPAC phenomena, is it going to be there for another couple of years perhaps? Because if you remember, when the Americans withdrew, they blamed Pakistan for all their failures in Afghanistan. And perhaps that was one of the reasons that the Americans were not happy with the former Prime Minister, Mr. Imran Khan. Now, before I introduce you to our panelists and we get going, our production team has prepared a report. Let's watch that first.
Pakistan's 75th Independence Day, which was celebrated with great zeal and enthusiasm by Pakistani nation, was also became the source of the renewed vehemence and fervor in the Pakistan-United States relations. The United States greeted Pakistan on its 75th Independence Day and hoped that the relationship between the two countries would continue to grow. United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken, in his recent statement, congratulated Pakistan on its 75th Independence Day, as well as he hails the 75 years of diplomatic relations between the United States and Pakistan. In his statement, he said that the United States enjoys robust cooperation with Pakistan in many sectors, from the tens of thousands of Pakistani exchange students who have come to the United States to the 77 million COVID-19 vaccine doses United States have committed to Pakistan through COVAX. He also added that the United States continues to be Pakistan's largest export destination and showed confidence that Pakistan and United States relation will continue to grow. Meanwhile, Pakistan's ambassador to the United States, Masood Khan, in his message on 75th Independence Day of Pakistan, said that today we also celebrate 75 years of diplomatic relations and friendship with our ally and partner, the United States of America. He added that in past 7 decades, Pakistan and the United States together achieved a lot in the realm of establishing peace, security, and stability. He asserted that Pakistan and the United States will keep strengthening people-to-people ties that will nurture our relations at all levels.
Now, welcome back after the report. Now, we have with us in our studio on my right is Air Vice Marshal retired Ikramullah Bhatti Saab, Senior Analyst. Thank you very much, sir, for your time. And we also have with us from Potsdam, Germany, Harley Schlanger. He is a political analyst, a political commentator. Thank you very much, Mr. Harley, for your time as well, sir. Pleasure to have you on the program. And we'll also be talking to Kamran Yousaf, one of the leading journalists in Pakistan, anchor person and also a writer. And he's going to join us at 8:30 on the telephone. But let me put the first question to you, Avim Saab. Now, a very positive statement from none other than the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, says that, we are very happy as far as the 75th independence year is concerned. He has congratulated Pakistan, and also on top, he said not only for the independence but for the 75 years of diplomatic relationship. Now, sir, if I may ask you a straightforward question, 1947, 2022 makes it 75 years. During this 7.5 decades of friendship, or whatever you may call it, a transactional relationship or strategic relationship. We used to hear so many different kind of words, sir. What have we gained, sir?
Well,
as an ally.
As you mentioned, it has been a transactional relationship, in fact, all along for the last 75 years. And of course, at the outset, we had this fear of our insecurity vis-a-vis our arch enemy, India. And then, of course, we were looking forward to transfer of technology, education, and financial assistance. And we find that as and when a milestone arrived in our relationship of transactions, there was a reciprocation from the U.S. and Pakistan did get its share of the relationship or the transaction. And we have seen it all along happening until today. And now we find that with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Taliban coming into Kabul, it appears that we have run out of any need of transactions. But we find that there are still quite a few interests that remain for the Americans to pursue in the region. And Pakistan does continue to remain relevant for the U.S. But the tricky part is that both Pakistan and USA have their respective strategic allies as the enemy of the other. While India is a strategic ally of the US and it's Pakistan's enemy. And Pakistan and China.
But the million-dollar question is, sir, India is the ally of Russia also and a strategic partner. So the case is with the United States of America. How the hell are they keeping that kind of a balance, sir? At one, and secondly, when it comes to Pakistan, sir, we are always forced. Either you are with us or you are against us. Remember that famous statement of none other than the former President, Mr. Bush. So, what is it about?
It's very clear, quite understandable that India is a large country, a large market, and it has a position in the world because of this, and both Russia and America, they like to keep India on their side, and Indians are playing, are leveraging this situation very effectively vis-a-vis both USA and Russia. Whereas in the case of Pakistan, unfortunately, we continue to remain economically weak and also politically unstable, which makes us very vulnerable and exploitable. Hence, we have no leverage to use against or in case of any situation vis-a-vis any major world player, be it Russia or be it the US. So, we have to listen to whatever wishes that they want to dictate to us, and unfortunately they are able to exploit us just because of our vulnerabilities, which sadly we have not been able to address all along, because had we been economically strong or politically stable or both, then we would have been in a position not to be dictated and not to be arm twisted, and hence be able to follow the policy which suits our interests the best. But sadly, that's not the case. Hence, we remain vulnerable.
All right. Now, let me go to Mr. Harley Schlanger. Mr. Harley, couple of points, sir. There have been ups and downs as far as Pak-US relationship is concerned. Obviously, post 2011, especially three major incidents I would like to mention here, they took place. One was about Rehman Davis, who killed 2 civilians in Pakistan, and while he was being rescued by the embassy staff, another person was also killed. You talk about the Salalah incident. If you remember, Americans called it friendly fire or a mistake, but at the end of the day, we lost the lives of 28 precious soldiers. Again, Osama bin Laden, May 2nd incident, 2011, when without even informing, we are not even sure, I mean the commission was formed, but whatever came out was never disclosed to the general public, whether he was there, if he was there, what was he doing there, and how long was he living there for. And then eventually, whatever happened, the Americans ended up telling the world that we found this man, we killed him, and we took his body away and we dumped it in the sea. Now, then Pakistan had to stop the NATO supply. That was the first time Pakistan in fact showed some guts, especially the military, and we went against them. That was the time when General Kiani was in power. Now, sir, things have changed over a period of time. Americans have left Afghanistan, and perhaps Pakistan was at that time one of those countries which was so-called the non-NATO ally but highly sanctioned, one of the most sanctioned countries, and that sanction which was put in Pakistan was from the United States of America. The question is long. Now, 1961-62 visit of General Ayub Khan, sir, we all witnessed that. He was showered with petals in the New York streets, and 7-day long visit, and the way the body language was witnessed. I mean, everybody thought that, this is it. And just imagine the Vice President of United States of America making stakes in Texas for the visiting president. Now, we have seen all that, but sir, now comes the time when the Americans really do not trust. Trust deficit is one problem, and secondly, at the same time, there's another issue, and that is about the Indians. Now, they have gotten so close. Obviously, if India is that close to America, where do we stand then, sir? Your take, because one adversary, our friend China is another adversary. We go to Russia, then the government regime is toppled. I mean, according to the media, this is what we have learned. I mean, what exactly is going on, and where do we stand as of 2022?
Well, let me begin as an American offering my congratulations to the people of Pakistan on your 75th anniversary of Independence Day. This is quite significant and quite important. But let me caution you about listening to what Secretary of State Blinken is saying. He also said to the Indians on their 75th Independence Day, few relationships are more vital than the one between the US and India. What we're seeing from the present government of the United States is what we've seen from the US during the last 20-something years. Geopolitics, playing countries against each other. The fundamental interest of the American government has been to maintain conflict between India and Pakistan, to try now to create a conflict against China, at the same time to gain support for the US operations in Ukraine against Russia. Now, all of these are destructive to the countries that the US is appealing to. And I think it's important to have a great deal of skepticism about anything that comes from Secretary of State Blinken's mouth. Look at his policy toward the Palestinians. Look at his support for the destruction of Ukraine and his commitment to getting more weapons into Ukraine, which means more dead Ukrainians. So what I think is important here is that there's a higher principle in statecraft, which is not being practiced by the United States, but is beginning to emerge in the global South among the former non-aligned nations. And let me just make one point on this that I think is important. The US policy should be to support the full economic development of Pakistan. But you go back to the 1970s and listen to what Henry Kissinger said about how dangerous it would be for Pakistan to develop nuclear energy. In fact, that was one of his big complaints about former President Bhutto. So I think the United States policy of the last 40 to 50 years has been to promote the old empire game of geopolitics, divide and conquer. Now, if I were a Pakistani, and of course I'm not, I would figure out how do we get out of this situation? And what I can tell you is that the Russia-China economic alliance offers tremendous potential for Pakistan and India, and the cooperation to rebuild Afghanistan rather than keep it as a failed state, which seems to be US policy. It was just announced yesterday that the US is not going to release the $7 billion that they stole from Afghanistan.
Correct.
So I would simply say, don't trust a word of Secretary of State Blinken. We need multilateral institutions, not a unipolar world governed by the United States and NATO.
Now, one quick comment, sir. That is also about a very important, I would say, reality. Now, India is looked upon as a market, one of the biggest markets as far as the middle class is concerned. According to certain surveys, sir, say within the next 30 years, India most likely will even take over China as far as the economic development is concerned. You talk about the billionaires, if there are X number of billionaires in the United States of America, X number of billionaires in China, and then the number 3 country is India, and 4th is perhaps Germany. What I'm saying is that they've got a lot of money. They have the strategic alliance with the Russians. They are still buying oil, weaponry, you name it, and they're doing their trade. And they're also ruble and Indian rupee, since they are the major currencies at the moment when you talk about the trade between these, bilateral trade rather, between these two countries. Despite having all odds with the Chinese, look at the overall trade volume between China and India, over $100 billion. You talk about a couple of other developments. But now, sir, one thing is for sure, and that is that the West is not going to leave India, perhaps because they look upon India as a potential market, obviously. So, whereas Pakistan, we all know the economic situation, even we are begging for $1.2 billion just to, release the pressure on the Pakistani rupee. Just 1.2 billion, sir. Whereas in India, you talk about Adani, over $100 billion worth, of his businesses. You talk about Ambani, almost the same. You talk about Tatas. You talk about Mittals. I mean, these are the super rich people of India. On the other hand, when you look at Pakistan, I mean, corruption is one major issue. Major development hasn't taken place. I mean, look at this flood that's hitting each and every corner of Pakistan. There are no dams to store water. I mean, there are multiple problems. I think we only concentrated on our military side and we made it very strong. Whereas other institutes, they are pretty weak. We all know where the judiciary stands as we speak, where the democracy stands, as far as corruption is concerned. The political parties and the names are pretty obvious. I mean, it's not me who's saying it. I mean, you go through the articles in Wall Street Journal or New York Times, and you know what I'm talking about. I mean,
Well,
in
let
these,
me tell you,
please go
I
ahead.
think the problem is the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which have stopped funding economic development in the so-called developing sector. And this has gone on now for 50 years since the breakdown started of the Bretton Woods system. The original idea of the Bretton Woods system of Franklin Roosevelt, which was the policy when India and Pakistan became independent, was that the US and the Western European countries would help the development of those countries through export of capital goods. That's never taken place on a meaningful level for Pakistan. And I don't know whether it's an anti-Muslim sentiment in the West or whether it's just old-fashioned British imperial geopolitics being adopted by the United States. But there is an effort to stop real economic development and instead to use the debt of Pakistan as a club to force Pakistan to adopt austerity policies. This is something that former Prime Minister Khan, Imran Khan, was warning about. And I'm afraid also Blinken's promise that the IMF will help Pakistan with the debt crisis. There are something like 45 developing sector nations facing default on debt. The IMF is moving in to offer some peanuts to cover a little bit of the interest of the debt, but to keep the debt on the books. What the Schiller Institute, which I represent, is calling for is canceling that debt or putting a moratorium on it so that credit can go to real production, physical goods production, infrastructure, and so on. If that doesn't happen, no matter what Blinken promises, no matter what the IMF promises, there will be no development aid for Pakistan, only an enslavement policy. And I think, as you pointed out before, the military has stood up recently in defiance against the idea that Pakistan can be treated as a dumping ground of a debt collection agency. I'm hopeful that countries in the global south will finally realize they have power. You mentioned markets, you mentioned population. They have power. Don't allow the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union to dictate policies to you. You're a sovereign nation and you need to act like one.
All right, now we've also been joined in by Kamran Yousaf Saab, senior journalist, anchor person. Assalamu alaikum, Kamran.
Ji, assalamu alaikum.
Good to have you in the program. Now, Kamran, you write so many articles about Pak-US relationship, and especially when it comes to Afghanistan, because whether we like it or we don't, during the last 20 years or so, Pakistan has always been looked upon, from the Afghan point of view. Now, the latest statement from Mr. Anthony Blinken also says that, we are ready to improve our relationship, and they have congratulated Pakistan on the 75th Independence Day as well as on the 75th diplomatic relationship year. Now, tell us, after the regime change in Afghanistan, it's been exactly 1 year. Let's tell the viewers, what do you believe, in your point of view, this 1 year has been good for Pakistan? Was it good for the Afghan people? And how do you see, things unfolding in the future?
Well, as far as Pakistan is concerned, I think when Afghan Taliban took control of Kabul, the major concern in Pakistan, of course, before that was that Afghan territory under the previous administration was used against Pakistan, particularly to undermine Pakistan's security interests, and that is why Pakistan's western border was not secure. And Pakistan was hoping that once Afghan Taliban took charge, they would address Pakistan's concerns, particularly with regard to the safe havens established by Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and its other affiliate groups. But what we saw so far, that Afghan Taliban did help Pakistan bring the TTP on the negotiating table. But if you see initially, when Afghan Taliban took over, the number of cross-border terrorist attacks from TTP really increased. And till April this year, there were about 120 Pakistani security officials lost their lives in those cross-border terrorist attacks. And after that, of course, the TTP entered into some kind of a ceasefire deal with Pakistan. So a year on, Taliban now in charge, this TTP issue remains a major challenge. And on that front, barring that Afghan Taliban apparently are very sincere in trying to resolve this issue through dialogue, I think there are still concerns here in Pakistan that that issue needs to be dealt sternly. And secondly, of course, that Pakistan was hoping that once you have peace and stability in Afghanistan, then you can unlock the potential of using Afghan for economic and other trade links to Central Asia and beyond. But of course, that we know that still Afghanistan is facing lots of economic problems. They are still under kind of economic sanctions. No government has really recognized them. So that dream is still remains a dream. And as far as Afghan Taliban are concerned, I believe that I think by and large, international community, even the United States, and recently we saw India even is engaging with them. But I think that they also fail to convince the international community on the promises that made, for example, not allowing their soil to be used again by terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. The recent killing of Ayman al-Zawahiri was certainly a setback and embarrassing for the Afghan Taliban. Similarly, on girls' education, they relented back on that promise. So I believe that still the situation in Afghanistan is volatile, and I think it takes a lot more for Afghan Taliban to convince the outside world before they get any international recognition.
Now, number two, do you think Afghanistan has changed during the last 1 year? Because what we have understood so far is that the Taliban, they're still implementing that typical their version of Sharia law, and the kind of footage that we normally receive. Obviously, if you are biased, few tell you a different story altogether. But those strict laws, and obviously when we look at the Afghan population, which is also pretty young, interestingly, the kid who was born, let's say 22 years ago, when the Americans attacked Afghanistan, is now 22 years old, used to this high-tech phones and internet for that matter, and they have a different exposure altogether. So the youth of the society versus the Taliban regime, what sort of a conflict do you see?
I think when it comes to a one-year performance or, the current situation in Afghanistan, on the positive side, of course, that the security situation has improved significantly, barring, few attacks here and there being carried out by Daesh. Of course, that will, of course, continue. But then the problem is that Afghan Taliban, did show that they are a changed entity when they took over, for example. Previously, you cannot imagine that they will allow, television channels. They will not, their leaders will never ever give interview to female anchors. So at least that there is a change on that front. But of course, that many people who closely follow, developments in Afghanistan, they believe that those were just cosmetic changes. Still, as far as, their strict interpretation of Sharia, that is very much there because there are divisions within, the Afghan Taliban ranks. Some of them are in favor of accommodating the concerns of the international community and try to be more moderate. But others still believe that we should strictly follow, the same school of thought or ideology that we had been following, when we first took over in the late 90s. And because of this reason, they could not arrive at a consensus regarding the girls' education, although that by and large, many religious clerics across the world, the Muslim scholars, believe that it is the right of every individual, whether irrespective of, their gender, that they should, get the education. And also given the fact that during last 20 years, when U.S. was there, when the U.S. forces were there were hundreds of billions of dollars were pumped in, and there were also private companies over there. And then, of course, that there was a lot of development, although there were allegations of corruptions and all that. So certainly the youth of Afghanistan have seen different Afghanistan compared to the late 90s. So, of course, that it is a big challenge for that particular youth to reconcile with the vision or the version of the Afghan Taliban. And I believe that is why that conflict very much is there. So the challenge for Afghan Taliban is certainly is to win the hearts and minds of the people, which I believe is their major challenge.
All right. Thank you very much, Kamran, for your comments. Now, Imam Saab, a couple of points here. One is that Taliban is the reality. That is perhaps one of the most important reasons that the US administration ended up negotiating with the Taliban. Zalmi Khalilzad was the man, and Doha declaration or Doha talks, that was something which was the talk of the town, I would say. Eventually, sir, the Americans left. A lot of trust deficit, appeared between Pakistan and United States of America. And then you remember the visit of the former DGISI right after almost a year ago to Afghanistan, where, while holding a cup of tea, he said everything is in control, everything is going to be fine. We all thought that, even the Indian media played a lot of propaganda, and they said, see, we were telling you that, Pakistan is, so close to the Taliban, and the regime has changed, and we have been wiped out, our, footprints won't be there anymore in Afghanistan, plus on top the kind of, leverage the Indians had over the Afghan government is not going to be there anymore. And one more important factor, Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, while he was going to Doha, very categorically mentioned it to the Indian authorities, especially to the higher people in the top post, and he said that, since you do not have any control over them, that is why we are only consulting with those elements which have some sort of, say on the decision-making process of the Afghan Taliban, and perhaps they are none other than the Pakistanis. So things were very clear. But sir, during the last 1 year, the kind of attacks that we have witnessed on our soldiers, the only good news was about the killing of the chief of the Mohammed chapter, Umar Khalid Khorasani. Otherwise, sir, we haven't heard much. So where exactly do we stand when we talk about this commitment to bring in peace and stability in Afghanistan, especially from the Pakistani perspective and the American perspective? Do they have something which we call the alignment, or perhaps they are still poles apart, looking after their own personal interest, and this trust deficit of issue is going to remain there?
Well, you see, the destruction caused in Afghanistan, we find that the US is directly responsible for it. And now that we see that the Americans have refused a large amount of funds which are Afghan owned to return it back to the Afghanis, over $7 billion. And right now, the biggest crisis or biggest handicap the Taliban have is their shortage of resources, basically funds. And if the America was sincere and serious in bringing Afghanistan to a peaceful situation, then it would have allowed the release of those funds, and which has not happened. So that means that the US is not very serious or sincere in bringing peace or stability to Afghanistan, and they are happy with Afghanistan staying the way it is, so that they can continue to feel the need or demonstrate to the world that there is a requirement for the US to go back in again. And unfortunately, as the case of Pakistan is concerned, we find that the TTP has been residing over there for the last so many years. The Americans did not do anything about it, and they let them have a free hand in operating from there and undertaking operations in Pakistan.
Then how come the killing of Umar Khalid Khorasani took place, sir?
Well, you see, the Taliban do have a relationship with TTP, and they also at the same time have a commitment to the US and to the world that they will not allow their soil to be used against any country.
But so their soil is being used.
And
Look at this BLA, BLF, you name it, and they're there.
And the fact is that, I mean, that's my personal view, that instead of being a mediator and between TTP and Pakistan and trying to bring them on a negotiating table, it was their responsibility to ensure that the TTP does not operate from there against Pakistan. And I think we should have just left it there, that look, it is your responsibility, you are supposed to ensure. And if either they do not have the capacity or the will, or maybe both, and that is why they are not able to control them. And I think if Khurasani got killed, there may be some difference locally between them and the TTP, where in order to settle that they undertook this operation. Otherwise, we find that they are continuing to encourage or invite Pakistan on a negotiating table with the TTP, which I think, personally speaking, is incorrect. We should just be counting on them and holding them responsible. And if they are not able to do that, I think we should go back to the US, because US was the other signatory to that agreement. They are supposed to, because they committed to the US that they will not allow their soil to be used against any of the regional countries. And if the Taliban are not able to do that, or they do not want to do that, then I think the US should be required to intervene and ensure that this doesn't happen.
One important factor, do you think, sir, when we talk about the intelligence sharing, I mean, that is also something very important, which ISI was doing with CIA, so was CIA with ISI to a certain level. Obviously, they have their own interests that need to be safeguarded, but still a lot was happening. Now, sir, in this particular regime, when Taliban is the authority, where the Taliban is supposed to be the most powerful faction at the moment, whether in minority, but they have the power, like Hutus and Tutsis, something similar. Now, what I'm saying is, sir, that do you think this closeness regarding Afghanistan, the closeness which we are witnessing now between Pakistan and the United States of America, can cause issues or perhaps problems or some sort of hindrance between Pakistan and China and Pakistan and Russia, sir?
I think that's the intent. The intent
Yeah,
of the US policy.
okay, your comment first, Mr. Harley, then I'll come back to Evim, sir. Yeah, please, go ahead.
I think the intent of US policy is to keep the tensions going. That's why they're not allowing the money to be returned to Afghanistan, why they're allowing starvation in Afghanistan, poverty in Afghanistan.
According
There's
to
a
CNN,
report
1.1 million children only are at a verge of starvation or are already starving.
Yes, there's a report from the UN that 97% of the country is falling below the poverty line and over 1 million children are malnourished. Why is the US doing nothing about that but spending $40 billion to provide weapons to neo-Nazi military in Ukraine? The US policy is not benign. And that's why I was warning earlier, don't listen to the silver-throated words of Blinken. Look at the policy. They want to split Pakistan, India, China, and Russia so that they can continue to have a unipolar world. I think it's in the interests of virtually every country, including Germany, where I live, not to support this policy of divide and conquer, but to look for areas of agreement. And one of those should be rebuilding Afghanistan. And it's a moral imperative for the United States, if it wishes to escape the scandal and the horrible reactions that they're getting because of Afghanistan, the U.S. should work with China, the Belt and Road Initiative, to help rebuild Afghanistan, which would also benefit Pakistan. If the United States is not going to do it, don't assume that there's any help that they're going to offer that will be meaningful for the people of Pakistan.
So your point of view on the same point?
Well, the fact remains that the US is continuing to pursue its reiterating or re-establishing its position as the sole superpower. And as we just learned that providing $40 billion to Ukraine is part of the same project that they have in hand. Visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan is part of the same. And
Yes.
of course, trying to contain China through India or trying to engage Russia in that war and to keep Afghanistan the way it is they're all interlinked with the sole objective of reiterating to the world that USA continues to be the sole superpower. And now it is up to the rest of the world to see through this attempt and to take care of their own interests, so that they're able to live comfortably, peacefully, and without any such control exercised by the US.
Now, another, sir, because since I'm running out of time, but this is a very important question. So now there were reports, last night I was watching the Western media, rather it was all over the television, that 5 of the lawmakers from the United States of America are visiting Taiwan. And obviously the Chinese had shown a lot of reaction when Pelosi was visiting Taiwan. Now, right after that particular visit, sir, which took place after 25 years, when we talk about the high profile American visiting, the Speaker of the House, when they came back, talked about democracy and everything. Do you think, sir, a similar sort of a policy or perhaps an agenda is also being applied on the Chinese regarding Taiwan, the way the Russians were forced to get involved in the Ukrainian war?
Certainly.
And the repercussions regarding Pakistan also, sir?
Certainly, because you see, we know that for the last 40-50 years, the USA had been respecting one China policy and committing that to the Chinese. But now we find that after having engaged Russia in the Ukraine war, China, the US is attempting the same vis-a-vis Taiwan. But the situation is, I think, quite a bit different from Ukraine, because Ukraine, of course, was contiguous with Europe, and it was very easy to engage Ukraine in a war like this, to arm it up, to give it financial assistance and military assistance so that it continues. But that is not the case with Taiwan. It is so close to China, it's quite dependent on China in the case of trade, and it is so far away from the US, and there is no other contiguous.
But there is a lot of military presence of the Americans in that particular region, sir. Korea, Japan, you name it, and they're there.
Well, yes, but the fact is that the equal amount, if not greater amount of the Chinese military presence is also around, and they're exercising that on a regular basis. But China will certainly not have that kind of urgency as the Russians had vis-a-vis Ukraine. So they are in a position to wait and see, and they can wait for an opportune moment, and where the US will not be able to incite Taiwan or incite the entire situation to a level where the Chinese have to intervene militarily.
All right, thank you very much, Yousaf, for your comments. It was a pleasure listening to you, Mr. Harley, and I would also like to thank Kamran Yousaf for his comments as well. And that's all we have for this hour. Inshallah, I'll see you tomorrow at 8:05 p.m. Till then, you take good care of yourself. Khuda Hafiz.